Hello there, so while level scaling systems can be found in a bunch of games, I find Osu's particularly interesting. On the surface, it does exactly what you'd think. Difficulties on a set progressively get harder as their names and star ratings indicate. When looking more closely though, you can see a phenomenon generated by mappers trying to regulate difficulty progression. Even though there are countless ways to make maps advance in difficulty, 99% of map sets do so in the exact same way. Mappers associate specific difficulty names, like easy, normal, and hard, with certain mapping concepts, and those concepts dictate progression through low difficulties. In other words, most easy difficulties share the same mapping ideas, most normal difficulties share the same ideas, and most hards do so as well. That may sound stale, but considering mappers so often make low difficulties for the sake of ranking their higher difficulties, it only makes sense. Low difficulties are like a chore. Nobody wants to make them because they're slow, unappreciated by dedicated players, and naturally limit mapping techniques for the sake of their target audiences. But at the same time, ranking only high difficulties inhibits new players from joining the game, so low difficulties are necessary if Osu wants to survive. That being said, the concepts 99% of low difficulties use are easy to replicate and don't cause controversy, making them the go-to for simple and fast low difficulty construction. I have a feeling you're like me, and the majority of other mappers out there who have little interest in creating low difficulties, so let's try something out. Instead of wasting your time going over every edge case way of mapping low difficulties, concluding with a vague statement, anything works as long as it's well organized, I'm gonna try explaining what matters. I'm gonna walk you through the basic mapping concepts I use in all my easy, normal, and hard difficulties, along with the most common related mistakes I've seen in the hundreds of map sets I've modded over the past few years. As an example, I've made 3 low difficulties for one song here, and they clearly show the progressive difficulty concepts I use in just about all my map sets. So let's get started. Easy difficulties are targeted at people who have essentially never played Osu before. Being as simple as possible is my goal when creating them, so I follow the music while avoiding just about anything that could even potentially cause confusion. First, my difficulty setting choices land on the lower end of the spectrum. Anywhere around 2 to 3 for each option is my preference because that allows enough time for players to comprehend everything on screen and leaves margin for player error. Slider velocity changes are non-existent in my easy diffs because they're just too confusing. If you've ever seen people play Osu for the first time, they barely know how sliders work, so adding variation to what's already complex is kinda overkill. Base slider velocity, just like difficulty settings, should be set somewhat low too. I usually go with anywhere between 0.8 and 1, since being any lower can cause problems with distance spacing and being higher is heading into normal diff territory. If you didn't already know, distance spacing is this number in the top right used alongside distance snap. Think of it as spacing relative to slider velocity. If it's too high, movement between objects is unnaturally fast compared to movement along slider bodies, and the opposite if distance spacing is too low. A 1 times multiplier is equal movement speed between objects and along slider bodies, so I like to keep this number as close to 1 as possible. Also, it should go without saying that I keep distance snap enabled at all times on my easy difficulties. It automatically handles time-distance equality, the most intuitive type of gameplay, which is perfect for new players. Rhythmically, my easy difficulties consist almost entirely of full beat gaps between objects. I use larger gaps in rhythm to break monotony and avoid anything rhythmically complex, which makes for simplistic yet stimulating rhythm composition. The first section of this map shows all those ideas pretty clearly. Because my rhythms are based on full beat gaps, I use 2 beat gaps between phrases to give players a breather of sorts. Continuous chains of the same rhythm can easily become boring, so I consider these small breaks essential. Also, look at these reversing sliders. Each of the reverse arrows land on offbeat red ticks, which seems pretty out of place. The song's melody definitely supports objects on these ticks, but to make it as intuitive as possible, I've mapped each offbeat sound passively. Players don't need to actively click the out of place red tick, they just hold the slider through it, which makes it really easy to play. While rhythm in easy difficulties is dumbed down a lot, it's still vital to remember that simplicity isn't a reason to ignore clear points of contrast in the music. Looking back at the first section, the only thing that rhythmically stands out is the group of circles near the end. Because the section comes to a climax here, I decided to show that through more dense rhythms. It may not be as stream as the higher difficulties have, but it is more dense than the surrounding rhythms, and therefore it gets across the same idea. The next section is much calmer than the first, so my simplified rhythm choice expresses that as well. I use 2-beat long sliders, which are longer than any sliders in the previous section, and I insert a few more 2-beat gaps between objects. Even though both sections are simplified to the extreme, the second has less intense rhythms as the song supports. Rhythm simplification can also lead to trouble when there's a lot of important sounds occurring at once. In the chorus of this song, there's an important sound on the red tick before the downbeat and another important sound on the downbeat. Covering both would result in half-beat rhythms, which I'd rather avoid at this level, so I have to clearly choose what instrument I want to prioritize. Because the vocals are the melody in this section, I made every actively clicked object match up with an emphasized vocal syllable, which should be intuitive enough for new players. So yeah, simplified rhythms should still clearly reflect the music. That sentiment also carries over to normal and hard difficulties since they rely on simplification as well. Rhythm aside though, object composition on easies is something I see people have trouble with sometimes. Given easy diffs are supposed to be as basic as possible, anything that makes reading objects a challenge is best left out in my opinion. So like overlapping circles and heads or tails of sliders is probably a bad idea because they're what players focus on. Weird slider shapes are a bad idea too because players don't even know how to play sliders yet. When long pauses in rhythm are used, I think it's also important to consider how the following objects are arranged. Because of the low approach rate, something like say this makes it look like the next object to click is the closer object when it's actually the farther one. The same could be said about something like this. The heads and tails of sliders could easily be mixed up. I find it best to make the order of objects as clear as possible on easy difficulties by instead doing this or this. So to sum everything up, my easy difficulties use consistent spacing and slider velocity, simple but representative rhythm, and clearly understandable object composition. Essentially the same could be said about my normal difficulties too, just bumped up a notch. Most people graduate from easies within a few hours of playtime, so I feel like the target audience for a normal is someone who sucks but at least knows how to play the game. For difficulty settings, I tend to use around 4 to 5 for HP, AR, and OD, then around 3 to 3.5 for circle size. Base slider velocity sits around 1 to 1.2, but unlike on easy, I change slider velocity multipliers a minor amount. Really, a change from 1 to 0.9 times is barely even noticeable, but I feel like it does help represent the calming down of the music between the first and the second sections. Spacing wise, I keep everything the same as easy. Distance spacing of 1 times with distance snap enabled. While easy used a base of full beat gaps for essentially everything, this normal uses a healthy mix of full beat and half beat rhythms, the latter of which intentionally overlap because of spacing and slider velocity settings. Looking at this first section, you can see that previously mentioned red tick rhythm is mapped with active clicking thanks to these half beat gaps between objects. And in the chorus, I mapped that previously mentioned red tick noise and the white tick vocals. With more rhythm density on normals, I can cover more sounds, but I often see mappers going a bit overboard with their half-beat rhythms. Being overlapped already makes half-beat rhythms cramped, so having like 6 objects in a row or more can easily feel overcrowded, and that's especially the case with half-beat sliders. Other than that, the only problem I see repeated on other people's normal difficulties is the usage of half-beat sliders with multiple reverses. Because the second reverse appears so quickly after the first, there's no time to react to it, making it unnecessarily hard to play. Object composition-wise, normals are pretty similar to easies. While they do include overlaps and stacks for half-beat rhythms, any other kinds of overlaps are non-existent, and the same could be said about weird slider shapes. I view normals as just a step up from easies, intensifying basic concepts and letting players struggle with rhythms a bit more representative of the music. Hard difficulties are where things actually change though. Instead of just buffing rhythm density, my hards introduce and intensify a number of other concepts, acting as a bridge to more outlandish, insane difficulties. The target audience for hards are people who feel like basic concepts in easy and normal are too simple, so they're looking for something, well, hard. Difficulty settings go way up compared to normal, around 5 to 6 for HP, circle size around 4, AR around 7 to 8, and OD 1 tick below that. Base SV is set around 1.3 to 1.5, and SV multipliers provide more contrast than what was barely introduced on normal. Rhythm here is focused around passive half-beat gaps made from a combination of half-beat and full-beat long sliders. And similar to easies, full-beat gaps and triples break the monotony of continuous half-beat gaps. diffs. Yes, that means 4th beat rhythms are acceptable on hard diffs, but just so things don't get too extreme, I limit myself to only triples every couple measures. Streams longer than that can be replaced by short reversing sliders, which passively cover the important sounds. And yes, short reversing sliders are okay, unlike those half-beat multi-reversing sliders on normal. While they do have the same problem, hards introduce more complex ideas, and this is a common one of them. Another one of those new concepts is variation in spacing, and it's probably the biggest factor separating hards from normals. Instead of relying on distance snap, I map hards with a loose form of consistent spacing in mind, while prioritizing visual spacing between objects over precisely measured distances. More importantly though, distance snap is annoying to toggle on and off when I incorporate spacing emphasis. On only the most important sounds, I include small jumps in spacing. Small. Small. Very, very, very small. I could say it 1,000 times and it still wouldn't get through to some people. Spacing on hard difficulties is more lenient, yes, but that doesn't mean unintuitive or extreme spacing is okay. To make spacing variation on a hard difficulty acceptable, all jumps need to be noticeably smaller than double the size of average spacing. Otherwise, it's impossible to actually read rhythms based on object placements. Half-beat jumps could look the same as full-beat gaps. Similarly, I feel a need to mention that spaced 4th beat rhythms aren't a good idea on hards either. Maybe I'm just too conservative, but I feel like slider leniency used in a way like this should be reserved for insanes and onwards. It defies ordinary spacing conventions which hard difficulties abide by. It's not one of the concepts commonly introduced on hards. And lastly, object composition on hard difficulties is much more complex than that on easies and normals. Pretty much all weird overlaps and slider shapes are understandable for players at this level, so I don't find any reason to restrict them on my hards. So overall, lots of passive half-beat rhythms, variable but simple spacing, and any types of object composition make up my average hard difficulty. A decent step up from normal, which some people find kinda weird, but maybe that's necessary given the way insanes and experts are developing nowadays. And that leads well into the whole point of this video. What are you supposed to take away from learning how the majority of mappers create their easy, normal, and hard difficulties? For starters, I know that a lot of mappers watching this might be annoyed by me so strictly defining each level of difficulty. Yes, distance snap isn't required for easy and normal difficulties. Yes, it's okay to spacebar half-beat rhythms on normals. Yes, acceptable rhythms change depending on BPM. Does explaining every little detail matter though? When a majority of mappers only care about ranking their insane and expert difficulties, I don't think so. It only opens up room for more questions, ultimately causing more confusion. I feel like low difficulties are a chore, and my explanations regarding how I map each one should help anyone who feels the same. When I was new to mapping, I wished there was just a clear and straightforward guide showing how to map each low difficulty because I didn't want to waste my time on them. I know that's a bad way to think about mapping, but I wanted to focus on insane and expert difficulties because they were more fun to create. Learning how to map low difficulties was just an obstacle, and the hard to parse, overly detailed, or carefully vague written guides weren't all that helpful. So if you're also of the mindset that low difficulties are a chore, design a spread using the gradual progression ideas I explained here. It'll work. This is what I think matters. But also keep in mind that there are other options available, and if you want to make your low difficulties actually interesting, maybe consider exploring those options. It's up to you. As for me, I'd go the boring route. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.